Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to be with you today for the opening of the Assets 2021 conference. I want to thank the organizing committee and in particular Jonathan Lazar, the general chair of the program, as well as Hedy Fang and Faustina Wang, who are the technical program co-chairs. Thank you for your invitation and also your guidance in preparing this session. Today, my topic is the DARE Index, which is a survey and a research program that we have been conducting for, in effect, for 10 years or so. That measures what's going on around the world in matters of digital accessibility. And so there are quite a few numbers and figures and graphs, so I think it will be more effective if I can share some of those with the PowerPoint presentation. So the monitoring of digital accessibility around the world is really something that we do with advocates, for advocates, so that in effect, they can measure what's happening in their respective countries. And why is it that this year, the Assets 2021 conference is so very important? It's fair to say that digital accessibility has never been as important as it is today. For 1 billion persons with disabilities, everything becoming digital can be a blessing or also a key barrier to everything. I'll just give you a quick snapshot as to how the digital world that surrounds us has exploded. There were 5 billion active monthly users worldwide for the most popular messaging app in 2020. That's 5 out of 7 billion people on this planet. And the internet usage during that COVID-19 period went up by 70%. And another metric which I like is that the Zoom peak daily participants was multiplied 30 times between December 2019 and April 2020 when the pandemic hit, and going up to 300 million users, daily participants, up from 10 million. And today, I think the Zoom application runs at an annual rate of 3.3 trillion minutes per year. In effect, most organizations realize that this is an irreversible trend, and the percentage of organizations that said that the pandemic has raised the importance of digital channel is 83%, while 62% of those organizations in the US say that the awareness of the impact of digital accessibility has actually been growing. That we derived from a survey we did with DQ System in April 2020 across about 292 organizations. So those are very big numbers. It shows that there is no escape, and that today digital accessibility is an absolute must for all activities in society, business, government. Just a quick introduction so that you know who we are, why we're here talking about the DARE Index. GISRICT, the Global Initiative for Inclusive Information and Communication Technologies, was formed back in 2006 with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the time when the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was about to be voted by the General Assembly. I think the notion behind the whole idea of GISRICT was that that new convention had incredibly important articles that would hit the countries that would become state parties to the convention in matters of digital accessibility or accessibility of information and communication technologies. And in fact, the convention was actually a true revolution, which I will describe in a moment. We are a non-profit 501c3 corporation in the US, and we work with the ICT industry. In fact, some major source of funding is voluntary. It comes from the private sector and foundations, organizational persons with disabilities, governments, and standard development organizations. So why is the CRPD so relevant to our discussion and to what we do? Most of you do at the Assets 2021 conference. Well, first of all, accessibility is one of the 8 principles that are the foundation of the CRPD. And it is defined as a condition for persons with disabilities to exercise their rights. So accessibility is really a it has to be there for their persons of disability, the rights for disability to be respected. There is no way around it. But most importantly for us, Article 9 of the Convention, for the first time in the history of international law, defines ICT obligations on par with those obligations for the built environment and transportation. So in effect, it says that having an accessible website is as critical and as important and as compulsory than having a ramp on the building to enter the building. In addition, the CRPD requires state parties to adopt standards to ensure that the public and private sector entities implement accessibility for the service to the public, and also promote the usage of new technologies, assistive technologies, and the internet by persons with disabilities. All things, if you think about it, that were designed back in the early stage of this past decade and are so very important today. So the people who wrote the convention had a real good view of the future when they did it. In addition, there are many articles in the convention that covers digital interfaces in key sectors such as culture, television, internet, education, employment, and so on and so forth. So it's truly a very important roadmap for digital accessibility around the world, and especially now that 182 countries have ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This map here shows like a whole world in dark blue with a few orange spots there and there, mostly 2 or 3 countries in Africa, meaning the entire world has ratified the CRPD. It has become a global ADA of sorts, but it has actually very, very tight provisions for digital accessibility, which is remarkable. So with that in mind, everyone has in their mind the same question. Okay, it's great that we have a treaty, but how the treaty is really effective, so how those dispositions on ICT accessibility actually translated into laws, regulation, policies, and programs by state parties? And what's the actual impact? Are they effective? Is it working? We need metrics. And so when you think about it, then you realize, you have all those policies and programs and good intent, but there is no metrics out there to measure anything. So that's how, as an advocacy organization, we felt, well, if there are no metrics, we just create them and build them. So this is what we are trying to do with the DARE Index. And you may remember the very famous quote from Peter Drucker: if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's really our motto with the DARE Index. And this is why we in a very persistent way, every 2 years, we conduct our research and pretty much cover most of the countries that have ratified the convention. In fact, their index results, you will see, cover 137 countries, which represent 91% of the world population. So again, it's a tool for in-country advocates and policymakers to actually benchmark what they are doing, where they are in terms of the progress they are making for digital accessibility across the board. And an important topic I want to emphasize is that the framework we use for that research was derived from the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, Human Rights Monitoring Framework. And that includes covering country commitments, country capacity to implement and country actual results and see what are the relationship between those three legs. This slide here shows you the welcome screen on the Distressity website. All those little flags go to a country profile where you can actually click and see the performance, the individual performance and metrics of that particular country. So it's really important when you do this type of research, and it can be quite controversial, that you put the data in the public, that it's accessible by everyone. They can go and check, okay, why am I like number 37 rather than number 41? Well, on this particular scale, this is what you are achieving right now. So people have a chance to also provide feedback if they don't agree. So that's an important, say, crowdsourced, feedback mechanism for data validation. So the three legs I mentioned, legal and policy foundation for the translation of the CRPD dispositions, are derived from the model policies we have developed with the International Telecommunication Union and different UN agencies that are kind of available to state parties to either compare or check or sometimes copy paste for the regulations and sometimes their own legislation. The capacity to implement variables, we decided to use some of the actually recommendation we have also in those reports, but we also looked at multiple regression conducted over the years that define which independent variable have the most impact on country performance as the dependent variable. And you will see the list of variables. They are quite intuitive, but some of them are not. So I will show you that in a minute. And the outcomes are a much more difficult thing. And we want to keep the perspective of personal disability. So local advocates get to actually evaluate themselves, their country's performance in different domains, be it for television or web accessibility or other form of accessibility in society. And we use there the top 10 categories of applications that Disabled People International, the International Disability Alliance, and Distressity promoted together for the decennial call for action after the CRPD was launched. That was in 2016. So just to dive quickly into the methodology, we have 20 key variables for each country, 5 for country commitments, 5 for country capacity to implement, and 10 for country outcomes. And each of the 20 variables gets 5 points, so each country can get up to 100 points if they are ideally accessible digitally. And again, all those detailed profiles and data sets are available to the public on the website. So how does it work when you look at each country? We try for each country to have, here I'm showing the example of Kenya, key country facts. So that includes, economics, GDP, all the measures that we normally have in a country. Country laws and regulation, country capacity to implement, country outcomes, summary of the score. And then we also have a tab for qualitative data that we collect through the questionnaire that come back. That will include, for instance, reference to laws and regulations or article in media concerning some application or programs. So it gives a better sense as to, how the evaluation is conducted, and it gives more a better sense of comfort when you read the results, and you have also the data and the total evidence that this is what's happening. So on the commitments, country commitments, we measure the first variable is commitment to international treaties on accessibility. And so there are really two treaties we incorporate in that variable. One is the Marrakesh Treaty that covers the whole area of intellectual property and the ability of blind persons or reading impaired persons to access content. And the CRPD itself, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we check if the country has a general law that protects the rights of persons with disabilities. If there is a definition of accessibility that includes ICTs in the country, that's super important, because if not, it's very hard to have policies and programs to support it really. Is there a definition of reasonable accommodation in legislation? Because again, if there is not, then it's more difficult for advocates to make the case for accommodation in accessibility in many domains. There is also in many countries a law that's called the Universal Service Obligation legislation. And we want to make sure that it does include persons with disabilities as a target population so that the Universal Service Fund of the country can be used for programs to support digital accessibility for persons with disabilities. In terms of capacity to implement, the 5 things we measure: is there a government agency for persons with disabilities? So that's kind of typically an agency that takes care of everything that has to do with persons with disabilities in the country. Is there more specifically a government agency that actually deals with accessible ICTs or accessibility for digital content and services? Because if there is not, then it's likely that the government of the country is not in a position to push for it. Is there a process to involve disabled person organizations in ICT access policy making? So that may not be intuitive to you, but through multiple regression analysis, this was the #1 variable that came up as absent when there was no performance and was there when there was good performance. In fact, from an anecdotal standpoint, we know and we see and we witness that the best program for the promotion of digital accessibility always include persons with disabilities in the development of the policy or program and its monitoring. Question also is variable is the country refers to international ICT accessibility startup. If they do, great. If they don't, problem. And then the last thing is, are there any ICT accessibility courses at universities in the country or professional development resources in the country? That's pretty much the key capacity to implement variable that we collect. Now, for the last leg, which is the analysis of the performance of specific sectorial programs, this is what we ask respondents to check, and there are different reference points. But basically, if there is no policy or program to support, say, accessible television, you get a 0. There is a policy, but there is no implementation started, we still give a 1. If there is a policy or program with somewhat of like a pilot implementation or just a beginning or minimum implementation, they get a 2. If the implementation has started, there is a partial implementation, but the impact is still limited, they get a 3. If there is a policy or program with substantial implementation, it's a 4, and a complete implementation is a 5. Of course, everything is subject to personal appreciation, and so we are super careful to check the continuity with the timeline, with the data we get by country. We are also sometimes checking anecdotal evidence, so we do some desk research to check some answers. And we also do some comparison by level of economic development, human development index, and so on and so forth. And we spot the data points that are way out of the range that we expect, and we go and check those individually. But all in all, honestly, our advocates in countries, persons with disabilities organization, they know what they are talking about, and they are quite fair with their own situation. So the list of variables for the outcomes is website, TV and multimedia, mobile telephony, ebooks and digital content, internet availability and usage, inclusive ICTs in education, inclusive ICTs for employment, e-government and smart cities, enabling assistive technologies and ICTs for independent living, and then procurement of accessible public goods and services for all citizens that include accessibility criteria. So those are the 3 legs of the index, and I apologize for being a bit long on this, but it's an important dimension of understanding what we present today. The next tab on the website will be the summary of the score, and on the left side you will see the ranking in the case of Kenya, which is actually a very interesting case. They get 70 out of 100, and they're 11th in ranking. It's one of the highest score among the developing nations. And so I think that the important picture behind that is that as you look at the global results, then the first thing that's very obvious is that there is clearly a connection between the level of economic development of countries and their total performance. Not so much for commitment, but as you can see on this graph here, the country capacity to implement tend to be very, very substantial for high-income countries and much weaker for upper middle, lower middle, and low-income countries. So in total, we have a variation that's based on middle income and upper middle and lower middle income. That is kind of a visual anomaly, if you will, in that the lower middle income countries fare a little bit better than the upper middle income countries. But that actually, we think, having looked at the data very carefully, is a matter of regional performance, with certain continents like Latin America, for instance, being in the upper middle income countries, and with many countries not doing too well. So that's the picture for the relationship between overall performance and level of income. And so here is the overall picture for the regional aspect of the performance. They reflect some very heterogeneous situations. So for instance, you will see the Middle East and North Africa having a pretty reasonably good level of performance, but in there are some of the poorest countries on the planet, but also the richest country on the planet. And obviously, when you look at the details, you see that the region is like a complete kaleidoscope of situation. It's not something you can really take for an analysis as significant. So it's just interesting to see that all those countries have different level of performance mixed together in regions and do not conclude to anything like East Asia and Pacific. Same situation, you have Japan in there, but then Taiwan then may not have some of the poorest countries having a good performance either. But Europe and North America are obviously the two leading regions in terms of overall performance. One thing that's really kind of interesting, and this graph shows you the overall their index scores on the life scale, and the horizontal scale shows you the year when the country is ratified. And so as you can see, the earlier they ratified, then the higher their index scores tend to be. It could be a double thing. It could be that the countries, when they were among the early ratifying countries, were already on the path of adopting compliance legislation regulations. But we also see that over time, when people look at the details of each country, the level of commitment becomes pervasive, and countries do actually take measures to implement the CRPD. And so that's why the older ratifying countries they are, the best score, and then more recent countries typically have a lower score. Now, to really understand the dynamics behind all those numbers, you have to look at the results by leg of the index. And so overall, today, the average country scores for commitments is about 65% of the 100% ideal situation. And it's pretty good, and I will show you why. but the capacity to implement is only a 46% level of performance. And the level of implementation or outcome for persons with disabilities, if you just take the partial or higher level of implementation, meaning there is already something that's positive for persons with disabilities on a certain level of scale, it's only 22%. So all those relationship between countries going out there and committing to do this and that, and then not having the capacity to implement and then having poor results is kind of a leitmotif in everything we do and analyze around the world nowadays for digital accessibility. So if you look at the country commitments, that's the first leg. 93% of the countries have ratified the CRPD. That's beautiful. Actually, the CRPD is one of the most successful treaties in the history of human rights in terms of speed of adoption, number of countries, and actually, I think, level of progressive implementation. It's also remarkable that 88% of countries have now a general law that protects the right of persons with disabilities. And, back in 2006, when the CRPD was passed by the General Assembly, there were a handful of countries with such legislation. And furthermore, reasonable accommodation, which is such an important concept to protect the right of persons with disabilities, and that is linked to actually discrimination. If you don't provide reasonable accommodation, you really discriminate against persons with disabilities. In 2006, there were a handful, like 4 or 5 countries in the world that had such a definition. And today it's 68%. So that's where you see that the CRPD legal framework is really having an impact, and definitely something that's pushing the envelope for the promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities. Now, only 61% of the countries have a definition of accessibility that is compliant with Article 9 of the CRPD, so that's 61%. 39% of the countries have not yet a legal definition of accessibility that's recognized as ICTs as part of it. So we are working on it constantly. We're also monitoring some good progress in that space. The same is true for universal service obligation legislation. Only 41% of countries have a USO legislation that specifically designates persons with disabilities as potential beneficiary of the Universal Service Fund. And that's also a very, very important gap that has quite a bit of consequences in the field. And then finally, the Marrakesh Treaty, which really provides the framework for access to content for print disabled persons, is only 37%, only 37% from the country. So that's really a very, very weak result. And that's despite several years having passed since the Marrakesh Treaty was launched. Just to show you quickly the progress that we see, the number of countries in 2018, when we did their index in 2018, we took the 101 countries that were responding in both years, so it's comparable data. 83% of the countries had a general law to protect the rights of persons with disabilities in 2018, 89% 2 years later. For reasonable accommodation, it went from 64% to 68%. And for the legal definition of accessibility that includes ICTs, it went from 49 to 59%. So when we look at the data, we feel happy that there is actually movement, there is progress, there is action being taken by countries to progressively adjust their legislative and regulatory framework, their policy framework, to push for digital accessibility. So in the middle of a lot of bad news, this is really super good news. Capacity to implement, the third leg, the second leg, we have very, very different type of results. While 88% of countries have a government agency for persons with disabilities. Only half of that refer to international ICT accessibility standards. So 56% of countries have no digital accessibility standard at all. And only 39% of countries have a government entity for accessible ICTs that specialize in digital accessibility. And that 61% therefore have nothing to in government to take care of it or to even understand it. Now, on the training and capacity building side, 38% of countries say, yeah, we do have courses at our universities or through organization of professional associations for training and courses on ICT accessibility. And that's an area where we really need to push very hard because it is inconsistent with the obligation of countries to have no capacity building resources. There are different levels to address, like an organization like Teach Access, for instance, addresses the notion of pushing curriculum at the university level, college level. Dyscapacity, one of our divisions, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, we train and certify existing professionals to be certified in accessibility core competency or web accessibility or document accessibility specialists and so on and so forth. So those are the two paths that are being pursued. But given the huge task that's at hand, all those initiatives are just in their infancy. I see we need a much, much bigger effort long term. The last but not the least, the very, very troubling statistic is only 26%, or basically 1/4 of countries involve persons with disabilities in ICT accessibility policymaking. 3/4 don't. And that's a guarantee for failure and little progress. So it's a real, bleak picture in that sense. But the good news is we think we understand where progress has to be achieved to create better momentum. That's just a quick pie chart to tell you that this is really like the most problematic issue that we see, that the non-participation of persons with disabilities in policy making. And furthermore, the key thing that to remember is that in the convention, there is a requirement for the involvement of persons with disabilities for the development of any policy or legislation that actually has to do with them, including accessibility and digital accessibility. So it's very specific, it's very clear. All those countries which have ratified the convention actually have that obligation to involve persons with disabilities. How to do that, how to build the competencies to do that is one of the topics that at GIST-ICT we're really focusing on at this time with about different international association of organizations of persons with disabilities. I think it's a critical aspect. We need to get more people with disabilities in the process of developing policies and programs. And to insist on it, why is it so very important is that most of the time people cannot guess the needs and expectations of persons with disabilities without their detailed input. There is also a great diversity of digital barriers that may affect persons with disabilities in various conditions, and you can't, unless you carefully get that feedback, you don't know. It's very difficult. And I would say also from a more political standpoint, persons with disabilities are motivated to drive accessibility agendas and their implementation. They want it to happen. So having them, part of the process is a guarantee that, for example, monitoring, for instance, things won't fall in the cracks because they want it to be done. But meanwhile, I think it's also very important to consider that the private sector and civil society is also a very important facet of the whole multi-stakeholder paradigm. And even in the private sector, you see some of the most successful programs are done the same way. They involve persons with disabilities in committees, in commissions, as employees, as engineers. And that's really such a very basic step to take in the public sector, in the private sector, and civil society at large. So that's a very strong message I wanted to share with you today. It's really a very, very important future potential for improvement. When you look at the different sectors that have been implemented by countries, on this table here, I'm showing the 10 areas that we are monitoring, and we decided to just to give you a sense that we would count those countries which have a policy that's being implemented at any level. So it could be minimum, but at least they have a policy and there is something happening. So if you take the definition, 61% of countries worldwide have something going on for television, 58% for the web, 54% for education, 51% for ebooks, 50% for government, e-government and smart cities. 49% have some type of program to promote the internet usage by persons with disabilities. 47% to promote inclusive ICTs for employment. 46% some public procurement dispositions. 39% assistive technologies and ICTs for independent living programs. And then only 38% for mobile telephony, which is again interesting in that it's such widespread technology with such potential. And there again, you see the progress between 2018 and 2020. TV went up from 47 to 61, web accessibility from 43 to 58%, ebooks from 40 to 51, public procurement from 31 to 45%, and mobile policies from 30 to 38%. So all I'm saying here is, okay, this is not great results, but the direction is clearly on the upside. And I think we need to be confident in some ways that with the appropriate continuous advocacy, those numbers may increase and then the level of implementation will increase. One thing that I want to emphasize though is that the level of actual implementation remain extremely low. So I take 3 examples: TV accessibility, web accessibility, and e-government and smart cities. So if you look at the scale, those countries, say for instance, with partial or substantial or full implementation, for TV accessibility would be 24% for partial, 3% for substantial, and 1% for full, a total of 28%. So if you look at it this way, only 28% of countries have a significant kind of program for that's actually implemented today for television, and 72% have nothing, or very little. Same for web accessibility, which is about 35% of countries doing some partial, substantial, or full implementation. And then e-government is the lowest with 22%, actually 18% partial, 4% substantial, and 0% full implementation. So e-government is a major obstacle at this time. Quick snapshot as to who are the top 10 performers around the world, just to get a sense of who is doing well. So if we take just the outcomes, that is the last leg, what they're really achieving. Top ranking is Qatar, followed by Israel, Australia, France, UK, US, Italy, Malta, South Africa, Brazil, and Uruguay. You know that there are 2 countries which or 3 countries from emerging economies, and that's a very interesting dimension that shows that money and financial means is not the only thing. It's also the political will and the organization and the commitment to do it. But in any case, that's the picture that we can see. Some of the countries are doing good. I would say a country like Brazil, for instance, is quite remarkable in the innovation for digital accessibility. That's true for television, it's true for the media, it's true for the web, and so on and so forth. Israel is another case, where I think it's probably the only country in the world that has a legislation that tells the private sector you must have accessible websites. So it gives you a sense of what's going on around the world. It's mushrooming. There are a lot of initiatives that are working well. Australia is also a very strong place for digital accessibility. So moving forward, I hope I gave you a contrasted view of what's happening around the world with potential progress and drawbacks and capacity to implement being the weakest problem, the weakest point in most countries. So what can be done moving forward in terms of global advocacy priorities, which is really what we do at GCICT, is to always try to imagine, okay, what's the next step we can do to push. So the first thing is, I would say, again, the momentum in ICT accessibility policy making is definitely a positive trend we can capitalize on. It's happening. Maybe not at the speed we would like, but it's happening. Again, it's imperative to involve persons with disabilities in ICT accessibility policy making and programming. And there is a need to push for the adoption of accessibility standards, because otherwise, no real good program policies can be implemented and checked in terms of their real implementation. And so capacity building, we believe, is highly required among advocates and policymakers equally. And so finally, if you go down at the organization level, training and certification of accessibility professionals in all sectors of activity are necessary to mainstream accessibility solutions. So those are kind of the things we are really looking at. So priority number one for GCICT, promoting the accessibility profession. Today we have about 2,700 members in 67 countries, about 29% international. We are growing pretty fast, but my vision is we should be at 10 or 20,000 members, because if you look at the number of countries, the number of key spots for professionals in those countries, that's where we should be. So maybe I will see it, I hope so. But definitely it's a profession it's on the rise, and it's a good thing, because professionals step by step are shaping the behavior of organization in terms of implementation of accessibility. The second priority we have is promotion of accessibility standards. We have been working with W3C and ITU and ISO and HC and all those organizations over the years to ensure that their standards are promoted in the best possible fashion, especially for public procurement. Why? And that's a very key aspect globally for digital accessibility. When you look at the IT marketplace, I come from industry as a background, so that's the kind of thing, if you will. You look at the IT marketplace, the size of the government and public sector markets is critical, and it's anywhere between 30 and 40% in every country. If the government says that I'm not going to buy any product that is not accessible, then all local vendors need to start wondering as to how do they make sure that their product and services are accessible. And in turn, that creates a little ecosystem of folks who are knowledgeable about it in each country, and that has a snowball effect. So it's super important. In the US, Section 508, in Europe, the new EN standard, and then we have been discussing those with the governments in Brazil, in Japan, in India, in different places, and we are getting good traction in many places. So this is very important. It's, in fact, unacceptable to spend public money to buy products and services that will end up discriminating against persons with disabilities. I think it's evidence, but people don't see it that way inside. But that's really important to push. Third priority is there are a lot of emerging sectors that are creating all kinds of issues due to their digital transformation. Smart cities is one. So we have a large program on smart cities with quite a few large cities around the world participating. That is reinforced with the upcoming G20 and World Economic Forum urban agenda that we actually are helping put together. And that's a great cooperation for G30. The justice system around the world is going digital, and there is not much consideration for accessibility or personal disabilities. It's a huge challenge. So we do conduct quite a bit of research in that space with different partners. The future of work is another space that, with the virtual world we are now in, is going to cause much problems, but also create much opportunities. So all those needs to be thought thoroughly as early as possible in the development of those digital transformations. And finally, maturity models are a type of tools that we are looking at very carefully. We're actually implementing maturity models in cities and universities and companies to help them assess how ready they are to really implement successfully digital accessibility. So that's the third priority. Priority number 4 is to continue delivering capacity building programs for government and advocates. So this year, a number of countries where in the past we have been involved in organizing multi-stakeholder events with the national government, national enterprises, and disability organizations. We are moving towards launching now actually a virtual program that is called the DARE Academia, derived from the DARE Index. And on this one, I'm very excited because we see that some of the major organizations such as CBM, Global Disability Inclusion, the European Federation of Hard of Hearing, and now the Worldwide Federation of Hard of Hearing People, IAP, the International Disability Alliance, DAISY Consortium, Disabled People International, Leonard Churchill Disability, and the World Blind Union are all participating in this program that we are launching at this time. The first step was actually, it was very interesting. We advertised the DARE Scholarship Fund. So we dedicated a part of our general fund to create a scholarship fund to help advocates in the country becoming certified. We had no idea whether we would get any traction on that, because the way we promoted it was reaching out to all kinds of countries, including the low-income countries. And we opened the scholarship program for 20 scholarships to start with. So it was a very conservative approach. But we got 248 applicants in 3 weeks. And when I look at the profile of those folks, I am astounded to see the level of sophistication, understanding, and most importantly, their level of commitment to promoting digital accessibility in their communities. It's just amazing. And so we are embarking now in pushing for that scholarship program to expand quite a bit so that we can offer the standard professional certification from IAP. That's actually supported by a course that we developed with a license from Princeton University to actually make sure they have the recognition, but also the competencies and the self-esteem and the self-confidence to actually push for digital accessibility in their local communities. That's a very exciting development for us, and super happy to see that. We're also developing a series of webinars on specific areas of concern. So for instance, making broadband available to persons with disabilities at the time of a virtual world is obviously critical. Well, as you saw in the statistics, not too many countries have real programs in place. So how do you do that? What are the good practices? How do you use the Universal Service Fund to finance that thing? Practical ideas, peer-to-peer sharing of good practice, south-to-south exchanges, so it's more credible for many people. That's all that we intend to do with the program. And hopefully we can make a little bit of a difference in advancing those agendas faster. I want to share a few references here, and you can go on the website if you need to have any kind of data to do any research project. We're happy to share. All that is actually explained in the website. So with that, I would like to again thank you for the opportunity to be with you all. It has been a real pleasure and honor to contribute to opening up this Assets 2021 conference. And I wish that all of you in your respective duties and professions can have the same level of fulfillment that many of us have in promoting digital accessibility, which is a real essential step to promoting the rights of persons with disabilities in the digital age. Thank you for your attention.